is going to be Dr. Alessio Terzi, and I hope I'm pronouncing well your name, Alessio. And we'll have a format, and we'll have a main speaker, which is Dr. Terzi, and we'll have a respondent, that is Dr. Roman Carrasco. And the title of today's event is Growth for Good, Reconciling Prosperity and the Planet. The way it will work is Alessio will talk for around 40-45 minutes. He will be presenting his book that of similar title or same title that was published early this year. So good, Growth for Good. And then after that, Roman will provide like a short 10 minutes, 10-15 minutes response. And after that, we'll have a Q&A in which everyone is welcome to make your questions. A brief introduction about the speakers. So then Alessio is an economist at the European Commission, and is also an adjunct professor at Sciences Po and HEC Paris. He's the author of this new book, Growth for Good, Reshaping Capitalism to Save Humanity from Climate Catastrophe. And his expertise is on sustainable growth, and he has been involved in the development of the European Green Deal. So Alessio is not the usual conservation. I mean, his expertise is not so much on biodiversity conservation as it is in the interface between economics and climate change or environmental sustainability. So then in this case, we approached him and we said, can you just present the content of your book, but also if you can think a little bit how to link this with biodiversity conservation. And then to link this in a more explicit way with conservation, we have Dr. Roman Carrasco, who is associate professor at the National University of Singapore. He's the head of the Environmental Sustainability and Economics Analytic Lab. And his area of expertise is conservation science, ecological economics, environmental health, land use change. His research group basically focuses on addressing the issue of can we reconcile economic development with biodiversity conservation. So I think we are in for a very exciting event. And so please, Alessio, when you're ready, you can share your slides, and we are looking forward to hear from you. Thank you very much.
So let me know if you can see my slides and screen. Good. Very good. So we're good to go. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Ahimsa, I feel like I'm more at risk of mispronouncing your name than you are with mine. And thanks a lot also to the audience for putting up with the technical issues. More in general, thank you to Integrative Conservation for the invitation. Indeed, it is not my usual audience, or let's say the other side of the medal of me not being the usual speaker for you is that for me this is not the usual audience, but I think that indeed we have a lot of common interests, and that is why I'm looking forward to the conversation. Now, to a certain extent, indeed, part of this presentation and part of the reason why Ahimsa approached me in the first place is because I wrote this book, which came out just over a year ago. So it is a bit older than the journal Integrative Conservation, but I consider both of them relatively young-aged. And yeah, it is a book that is. It was published by Harvard University Press. It is a trade book, meaning that I've gone at length at trying to write something that is not an economics textbook. It is not a book that requires you knowing macroeconomics or having a PhD in economics. It just requires that you have an interest in understanding the interplay between the economy, broadly speaking, and nature, broadly speaking, even though, as Ahimsa pointed out, I then sort of narrow it down to climate change, which of course is only one of our environmental challenges. And the effort I've done in trying to write a book that is accessible to most is that actually most of the technical discussions are at the end. So roughly a third of the book is endnotes, and with all the technical discussions and the references to papers and so on. So that it might be of interest to an audience that is looking for academic references. For everybody else, the book is easy to read. I've given by now, I believe, I've lost count of how many presentations of the book I've done over the past year and a bit. But I've realized that maybe the easiest way to just give you a sense of what the book is about, and this is not a presentation, strictly speaking, about the content of the book, so I will be mixing and mashing, but just to give you a sense of where I was coming from on these reflections, I've realized that a good way of doing that is to tell you 2 words about the genesis of this book. And this is very much a book that comes out of the COVID period. And of course, the audience will be familiar or remember the early phases of COVID. There was a new virus. Many governments around the world decided in favor of stay-at-home orders, lockdown measures, you call them, in different ways in different parts of the world. And effectively, everything was sort of going bad. So yes, we had lockdown measures, but still there was a public health emergency for people like me looking at the economy. The economy was not doing well. GDP was shrinking, consumption was shrinking. And for those that were looking for a silver lining, this came in the form of indicators that nature was doing better, let's say. So the quality of air improved. The quality of water improved. CO2 emissions dropped. At some point, you had these pictures of dolphins in the canals of Venice that were circulating around the internet. And I mean, later, I come from Venice or near Venice, so I can tell you that these pictures were not true, they were fabricated. And indeed, this was shown that these pictures were fabricated. But the idea sort of stuck with the public in general, I would say. And that is a bit the question of what is the interplay between the economy and nature? Or rather, could it be that even once COVID is long gone, or we don't have to use lockdown measures and so on, could it be that we actually need to shrink the size of the economy in order to improve on those environmental indicators that we know we need to improve, whether it is CO2 emissions, whether it is quality of water, quality of air, and so on. And so that is a bit how the book starts. And it starts with a reflection on the relationship between the economy and nature. As soon as you start thinking about the economy, very rapidly, you switch to economic growth. And that is a bit what this slide shows on the bottom. And then when you start reading about these topics, you realize you have to add an extra layer, which is the way the economy is organized, broadly speaking, in a majority of countries around the world, which is along capitalistic principles. Although there are varieties of capitalism, of course. And this generates a sort of holy or unholy trinity, depending on where you stand on these topics. And what the book does is to look at this trinity and look at the interplays between these 3 dimensions. And so, as I was hinting before, the relationship between growth and nature, but also the relationship between growth and capitalism. And that is to say, can we have capitalism without growth or not? And what is the relationship between capitalism and nature? And that is to say, can we improve our relationship with the environment? Can we improve biodiversity, which is a topic of your interest specifically, while keeping a capitalistic economy? And so if Ahimsa had told me that I had 5 minutes rather than 40, this is where I would stop, because in this slide, you have everything that the book effectively is about. Now, The first part of the book looks at this first relationship, and the conclusion that I rapidly reach in the first chapters of the book, after trying to explain what capitalism is and how it works and so on, or devising a compact definition of it, is that in a way there is a tight interplay between capitalism and growth, and that certain characteristics of capitalism effectively rekindle a search for growth based on current consumer preferences. I am underlying this point because we will return to it, but bear with me for a second. Based on current consumer preferences, in a way, capitalism leads to a quest for more growth in the system. And this is important because the implication of it is that, in a way, you cannot just say, you know, we're going to get rid of growth and the rest sort of stays the same. And that is something I hear a lot about, often from a variety of circles, but often also from natural scientists working in this space, which indeed are genuinely concerned about the health of our planet. And so this is commendable. And you will see things, including written on a recent article a few years ago on nature sustainability, I believe, which was a list of things we would need, I believe on climate change more narrowly, but it was, you know, we need more solar panels, we need more wind, we need more circular economy, we improve efficiency of extraction of raw materials, and so on and so forth. And by the way, we also need to get rid of economic growth. And the conclusion I try to reach early on in the book is careful, because getting rid of economic growth is not something that you can add to a long list of things we have to do just as the nth element, but rather it requires a restructuring, a complete restructuring of our economic system, which is still fine up until now. And while I was working and reading and writing about these topics, I realized that actually there is a large literature that recognizes effectively what I just told you. And that is to say that indeed growth and capitalism go hand in hand, and that therefore, if you want to get rid of one, you have to get rid of the other. And this literature effectively would say, you know, this is sort of the point. Yes, you have to because you have to curtail growth, you need to get rid of capitalism. And in a way, what I was telling you before, so this idea that people's desire for more is a product of the system itself. And so that once you get rid of capitalism, it will be fine because people will have enough. And this is good because then we can focus on nature. And we can focus on improving nature, and yes, this will mean that we will have less than in a growing economy, but that is fine because we will be satisfied with less and we will share more. And this allows me to make one point, which is to say again, in the book, I try to take as much as an open-minded approach as I can. And so I didn't enter into these topics thinking that I was there to defend growth for the sake of it or to defend capitalism for the sake of it. I don't care. Or let's say I entered into the topic in an agnostic way, saying we have some priorities. We've given ourselves some objectives, which are specifically looking at climate, some specific climate targets, which we take from climate scientists and from the IPCC. What is the best way from an economic perspective and from a political economy perspective to reach those objectives? And that is the only thing I was trying to achieve. And that is why I've been reading wide, and I've taken an open-ended approach also to alternative ideas, let's say, that are not mainstream, at least in the economics profession. Now, the policy conclusions of that type of literature, which takes many names, degrowth, eco-socialism, steady state economy, you name it, it depends a bit on the country. But the policy conclusions are, we need to get rid of economic growth, at least in rich countries, because of course there are countries that are least developed or emerging markets, and they still need to grow in order to provide for the poorest of the world. And so, of course, they will continue growing. The rich countries will give up growth. And in a way, the fact that they give up growth will open up space and resources for the rest, for the rest to grow. The relationship with innovation is rather open-ended, which is to say, yes, innovation might continue. So it's not that this literature is necessarily against innovation, but we shouldn't do it through capitalistic principles. And so you wouldn't want to let private sector companies decide what we're doing innovation on. We will have governments setting the direction of innovation and shifting resources to the priorities of the moment, whether this is fighting climate change, improving biodiversity, reducing soil erosion, and so on. And in a way, this literature takes eco-villages as a model for the future society. I don't know if you know what eco-villages are. These are actual places. They're scattered across the globe. There's many in Europe, but there's some in North America, South America, few in Africa, and some in Asia as well. And effectively, these are small communities of 100 to 100 people, so relatively small, who have given up on the principles of the economy. They live on basic trades. They engage in basic activities like agriculture. They share more. And so the idea here is to scale up that model to society at large, produce locally, decide through some form of collegial decision-making. And that is a bit where this literature goes. Now, after considering many of these options at face value, so again, I did not enter into this topic with an agenda, but I come to some different conclusions. And I think that the point of departure is a bit on this relationship between growth and sharing more. And you remember in a few slides back, I was saying, yeah, we will have less, but people will just share more. At least that is the idea of one kind of literature. What I'm saying in my book is careful, because in an environment where resources are capped, in an environment where there is no growth, and rather you are left battling over what is left, this is not an environment that is conducive to sharing. And again, I try to make this point, borrowing from a variety of literatures, trying to understand the psychological origins of social psychological origins of some of this. I look at economic history and moments where growth was low. And there have been many moments in the history of humanity where growth was low or flat or effectively steady state. And this was not an environment that was conducive to sharing of resources. And the reason for this is that I sort of take aim at this idea that I was mentioning beforehand, which is to say that the desire for more is not, in my view, a product of the system. And again, to make that argument, I try to look at different civilizations at different moments in times before capitalism was introduced, make the point that actually the desire for more, which is not more stuff, but broadly speaking, a desire for more is closer to a human inbuilt feature. And ultimately, you can read the history of humanity through these lenses, which is to say that we as humans have always had a desire to improve our conditions, and we have done that by using technology, by developing innovation in the service of what we wanted more of. And you can read the whole arc of human history going back to the use of fire, to the development of some sort of shelter, to the development of clothing, to the development of fishing, of sailing, and so on, as the interplay between a desire for more than what our human condition would have given us by its own, and the use of the only thing we're good at, which is developing innovation, coming together as groups, so shared, let's say, collective knowledge, and developing ideas to serve our needs and wants. So it is a bit of a desire of self-determination as a species. And in a way, you can read this, a lot of the activities we've done or we do throughout history, as realizing our limits and then finding ways to go beyond our limits. And this goes, it's not an economic feature per se. But one thing I wanted to do, given the audience, is to take a step back and really try to understand a little bit what economic growth is. And in a way, economic growth is a word, or is composed of two words. One is growth, and we know what growth is. In mathematical terms, it's a delta that is positive. In layman's language, it just means that the after is greater than the before. So growth, we know what growth means, which leaves us with the other word, which is economic. And so the real question is a bit, what is the economy? And in a way, in the most basic definition of the economy and what the economy is the sum of all goods and services exchanged for a price. Now, a price, and this is important, does not mean money necessarily. It just means that it is an exchange where you have something I want and I have something you want, and we exchange this. It can be barter. Okay, in economics, we could call that a relative price. So it means, I don't know, 5 apples are equal to 1 lecture. And so I give a lecture, you give me the 5 apples, and this is contributing to the economy, even though no money was involved in this transaction. And if you notice, what is missing here, or what is excluded, is act of benevolence. So if I give you, if I bring to the neighbors, I bake a cake and I bring it to the neighbors as an act of benevolence, that does not enter the economy. The reason for this is that beyond extremely basic levels of complexity, you can think that it is very hard to organize a society based on act of benevolence. So if I had to wait for acts of benevolence, I wouldn't get very far. Even in basic activities of the day, I wouldn't have managed to take a tram this morning because the tram driver would not have been there probably. I would not have been able to have my breakfast because milk would not have been found when needed, and so on. So beyond very basic levels of complexity, it is very hard to organize a society based on acts of benevolence. But what I was telling you is that for an economy to start, or to have an economy, it effectively requires that I have something that you want and that you have something that I want, which suggests that the economy is a very ancient concept, and that it did not start recently. It did not start with the Industrial Revolution. It did not start, in more recent times. But the only thing that it requires is some degree of specialization. And so it requires that I focus on giving lectures, you focus on making apples, and then we have something that we want to exchange. And the beginning of specialization effectively began in multiple places around the world at the same time, in different civilizations around 10,000 years ago, because it corresponds to the beginning of agriculture. And the reason for that is that agriculture meant generated surpluses, and that a smaller share than the whole could focus on food production, meaning that it would free space for others to focus on other things, whether it was to become a soldier, whether it was to become a priest, whether it was to become an artisan, and so on. It meant that we could start having specialization, and that was a bit the birth of the economy. Now, a common misunderstanding on these topics is for people to take a chart like this, which is a long-term estimation of the size of the economy of the world, and to say, look at this chart, effectively, there was no growth for the whole of human history, except that it started with the Industrial Revolution, roughly 200 years ago, first in Europe and then spreading across the world. But the point of this picture, and a point that is worth stressing, is that this picture is distorted by just the scale of how big the growth following in the Industrial Revolution has been. And that this flattens out the history that happened beforehand, which is not a history of flatness or stagnation. And one way of looking at this is to say that if I told you that in a way we use technology to serve needs and wants, and you can read also the birth of agriculture in that way, the fact that technology has been increasing throughout human history is a sign that the economy was generated and has been increasing throughout. And to show this point, I use the work of a Stanford historian, Ian Morris, who has tried to develop, he calls it an index of energy capture, but broadly speaking, it is an index of technological advancement. He does a separation between East and West that is beyond my point in this specific discussion, but it gives you a sense of what was happening beforehand, roughly since the beginning of agriculture, which has been a steady increase in technology, which then accelerated immensely around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And in a way, what is important for me to stress is that their past societies, past civilizations were experiencing economic growth. It's just that they wouldn't call it that way. They wouldn't be looking at GDP, they wouldn't be calling it the economy, but historians knew when a civilization was successful. They would pick it up in indicators like abundance, typically agricultural abundance, because it was food that was essential in agrarian societies. And in an agrarian society, food production is effectively equal to production, and it is an indicator of the size of the economy. They would look at population growth. They would look at military power. They would look at the fact that successful civilizations, what was considered so, would be able to do things that other civilizations were not capable of doing. And this allows me also to make another point, which is to say the economic growth or the economy and these concepts that we use are concepts that we use to make sense of reality, but it is not a way reality is organized per se. It is not that we're trying to capture the size of a physical phenomenon. It is just one way of reading, let's say, the success of our society. And I wanted, given the audience, I've borrowed an example from China and from the Song dynasty, more specifically, which was around the time of 960 AD to 1279 AD. And what do we know from that era? We know that there was technology, science, maths, and engineering flourishing. There was agricultural abundance and improvements in agriculture. Population was increasing. Iron production was increasing humongously, and there was military power and military strength. And these are a bit the indicators I was hinting at beforehand. And indeed, when exposed, let's say now, economic historians try to make estimates of, let's say, long-term GDP, they estimate that GDP, or the size of the economy, was very large. Actually, it was 3 times that of Europe, for example, at the time. which again is giving you a sense of the economy or GDP or economic growth as a sort of way of compounding indicator for a battery of other features that we have actually been interested in throughout human history. And I just wanted to, as I veer towards, let's say, the topic that you are more interested in, and that is the relationship between the economy and nature, I just wanted to mention one crucial point, which is to say that the approach I'm professing is one whereby I was saying humanity has needs and wants and uses technology to achieve them. In order to do that, it bends some rules of nature, let's say, to its own benefits. Okay? And we can read, again, agriculture as one example out of many of this principle, which is to say, initially, you had slash and burn and you had deforestation. Then you had the fact that, of course, you don't plant everything with agriculture. You plant what you need or you want more of. And in doing that, you are affecting nature around you, and you are bending the rules of nature to your advantage, specifically when you engage in hybridization, which is, of course, aimed at maximizing the properties you want more of in terms of size of the corn, in terms of accessibility of it, and so on and so forth. And of course, you don't need, most of you already know this, but this is just meant to show you what corn used to be like and what it is now, after a process of millennia of hybridization. Just one point, which again brings me closer to the topics of your interest and linking to agriculture, is to say the following, which is we are entering into a world, or we're entering into a scenario where extreme weather events are starting to materialize, and we've seen it, we're seeing it all across the world, in China, in the US, in Europe, in Pakistan last year, in several countries in Africa, in India with the monsoon season, and so on. So there's a variety in Canada with the wildfires. So we are entering in an environment that we will be effectively more unstable. And so the baseline ahead of us is one where if we don't do anything, we will effectively start having a decrease in yield or a decrease in food production. At the same time, we want to, I'm told from experts of biodiversity, that perhaps the one thing we need to prioritize in order to improve biodiversity, or at least avert further losses, is that we have to reduce our footprint on the planet. And specifically, this goes through agriculture and effectively reduce the amount of land conversion that goes to agriculture, allowing for habitats to be restored, or at least to be left alone. In parallel, world population is increasing, at least until the center of this century. And all of this is meant to say that if we do nothing, scarcity is what we have ahead of us. And an environment, again, it links to what I was trying to say before, which is in an environment in which resources are shrinking, sharing will not be easier. It will be harder. And so to just tell me, but you know, if food production is uneven, which is true, and some parts of the world consume much more, which again is true, will not be conducive to more sharing, which is something we would need if we enter in an environment in which food scarcity or overall production is going down. And so the crucial point for me in this respect is that within these constraints, we have to increase yields, which is the equivalent applied to agriculture of the economic growth argument. How this happens is beyond the point, or actually, I am indifferent to how this happens. Whether it happens with new genomic techniques, whether it happens with precision agriculture, whether it happens with vertical farming, I'm indifferent. But this is something we have to bear in mind. we know to a certain extent that it is possible, and that yields are not have been going up, and that production has been going up. It has actually been going beyond population growth, and that land use has increased non-proportionally and largely so. And therefore, there are huge improvements in yields that can be achieved and that have been achieved. For example, in cereal production, and this has resulted in saving large swathes of land to otherwise agricultural use and food production. Again, important from a biodiversity perspective. People would tell me, yeah, but we have achieved that, you know, at the expense of other dimensions, because of then you have to increase the use of pesticides, you have to increase the use of fertilizers. Well, not necessarily so. And I'm taking the United States as a case study here, a brief case study, just to show that indeed cereal production has been going up, land use has been going down, and fertilizer consumption has been basically flat since the 1980s, and so has been pesticide use. And so that this is meant to say that it is possible, rather than everything is fine. Everything is not fine, but there is a path ahead. Which allows me to make one point on growth and nature, returning to my topics of choice or strength, which is to say, and underline what I was saying before, growth did not start with industrial revolution. It is something that has been there, and it is effectively the other side of the medal of technology, innovation, and know-how in the service of human needs and wants, when we take it at a general, broad level. And that what we've experienced since the Industrial Revolution has been a specific growth model, one that is solidly anchored in burning fossil fuels, in a linear production model, and so on, and that has to stop. And so, again, this is not to say that everything is fine, but rather that different growth models are possible, and that we need to find ways to achieve different growth models. Just one point again, because it comes up, we can discuss it in the Q&A, but it comes up always, is the interplay between the economy and energy. And that is to say, yeah, but you know, an economy that grows still needs more energy, and therefore we need, I don't know, more extraction of resources to service those energy needs and so on. As a matter of fact, again, I'm taking the United States, but it's true for OECD countries on aggregate, that effectively since the 1990s, energy consumption or primary energy use has been flat. And GDP has gone up, in this case, by GDP per capita by roughly 40%, GDP on aggregate for OECD countries, so for rich countries, by 60%, while energy consumption, primary energy consumption, has been flat. And what this is meant to underline is that the economy is an incredibly flexible thing, meaning that you can achieve more with less. But of course, you need incentives to do that. So it does not magically happen. You develop innovation in the service of what you see as an urgency. And if you had plenty of energy, you didn't have the need of using less. If you had plenty of natural resources, you didn't have a need of using less. And as shockingly as it may sound to you, nature, for a very long time, or up until very recently, was seen as something that was broadly unlimited, or so big, so large that it was hard for it to be affected by human activities. And now it's not the case. It has taken us a long time to realize this, but it is not the case. And so as we will be prioritizing nature and nature restoration, we will take measures to do that, and we will innovate in ways to improve our relationship with nature in a variety of fields. But this has little to do with the size of the economy as a concept, which does not mean that the current economy is fine and that what we do in the current economy does not have an impact on nature. And so to biodiversity loss and so on, all of this in an environment in which nature will become more unstable. And so climate change, to a certain extent, is obviously a new problem, but it belongs to a similar category of problems that we've encountered throughout our history in terms of generating scarcity, in terms of the way we will approach it, which is developing new ideas and new ways of doing things in order to address these needs and wants. And that is why I believe that we will do that through the one thing that we're good at, and the only thing maybe that we're good at as a species, which is innovating. And in the process of innovating, we will generate a new economy, a different type of economy. You can call it green growth if you want to follow, let's say, popular terms. I don't care what you call it, but I think that we will generate a new economy, one that is adapted to our new needs. This brings me to the conclusions, in a way, of my book, which is that in order to avoid a climate disaster, because again the book focuses on climate more specifically, we will have to restructure completely our economies, and this will go through a huge acceleration of innovation, of green technologies. And in a way, capitalism has a lot of problems. It comes with rising inequalities, has centripetal forces, but if there is one thing that it is good at, it has proven good at, is developing innovation. And so what I wonder in the book, and what I lay out as a blueprint in the book, is can we reorient that machinery to our needs so that it helps us develop fast innovation in the things that we need fast innovation on, namely climate change, environment, and so on, rather than dreaming of smashing it down with repercussions also on our capacity to develop new innovation. In order to do that, this goes through government measures, and of course we can talk about that, but it does not stop at it. And that what I try to argue in the book is this is closer to a whole of society approach, because we will need businesses on board and we will need citizens on board, and we can discuss about how this is the case later on. This is my final slide, which is to say that the way I look at what is awaiting us, or what is ahead of us, is something that is probably close to a new industrial revolution, or a green industrial revolution, in the fact that we will have to reinvent the whole of production and consumption, energy generation, housing, transport, agriculture, clothing, and more. And that this has happened before. When this has happened, for example, during industrial revolutions, some countries have managed to pioneer, and some companies have managed to pioneer these technologies, experiencing great economic rewards as well, and others have remained stuck in the past. And so that the point I try to make in the book and in much of my work is to say that there is a strong interest in trying to take a leadership role, even from an economic perspective, even narrowly focusing on profits. It is smart to try and be a leader, a pioneer in green technologies of the future, whether this is on energy, whether this is on biodegradability, whether this is on new agricultural techniques. Because if you manage to be successful at pioneering some of these, you will experience great economic rewards. Once again, showing that it is not necessarily that economic rewards and nature are at odds, but it is the current model that we're in that is problematic. Just one word, and then I stop, I promise, on the social repercussions of this, which is to say that, of course, winners will be generated, and I was telling you that, but also losers will be generated. And again, we know this from the history of past industrial revolutions. And one point that is important to me is to say that when past large innovation waves have happened in countries where there were large swathes of people that stood to lose, that's where people got in the way of innovation. That's where they took measures and protests and legislation and so on to avoid or to slow down innovation. And that is something we cannot afford, given how urgent our climate objectives are. which means that the social agenda, so making sure that people are on board or that people that are losing out can see a role in the new green economy and so on, is not only a moral, say a moral objective, but it is important also because if not, people will oppose new technologies and will slow down our climate fight. And this is a point that, in a way, I borrow from this very nice book on innovations throughout history, throughout civilizations by Calestus Juma. There's a lot more in the book that obviously I could not cover, but I stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I wanted to first, I mean, briefly do some ideas that I thought they were very, very interesting, very insightful from the book. And then I was also asked to try to make a link with biodiversity conservation. And I think many of the lessons from the book are applicable to biodiversity conservation. So I think that that's an interesting thought exercise for us. So for some of the very interesting take-home messages from the book is that stopping growth has very negative implications, even some knock-on effects, which they were new to me. I found them very, very useful. And the realization that growth is needed is an imperative for the welfare state. That's how we are able to support our pensions, our unemployment benefits, and as Alessio shared in the book, many developed countries, around 20% of the GDP. Also, as the population is aging, what happens is that this percentage of the GDP that goes into the welfare state increases. So stopping growth is not really something that we can do. It will affect the backbone of the social support. Other things that are important is that countries have a debt, and this debt is considered sustainable because we expect the economy to grow. And then this debt is many times repaid with the growth. It's not repaid with taxes. If we don't have growth, we have to increase taxes, which is going to affect also people that are more disadvantaged. Also, very insightful for me was the strong link between economic growth and innovation and economic growth. If there is no growth, we're stopping innovation, and then many times the new jobs, the good jobs, as Alessio put it, are these green jobs. So that would be also a big problem. So I think the case is built very strongly, and there is no doubt that stopping growth or degrowth is out of the question, because they will have a cascade of debt defaults in the economy for countries. The countries will not be able to borrow, will have to increase the taxes, so it's going to be downward spiral. And then without innovation, we're not going to have many of the tools that we need for the green transition, for climate change or biodiversity. So if we stop growth and we aim for degrowth, we're going to start a major crisis. And that's not the best idea when you're already having to deal with the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis. We want to have at least the economy function, right? So I think that's a very important message from the book. I think it settles very well the debate. Then not only that, then the other part of the book I found interesting is not only that the growth is out of the question, is that we can use growth for good. We can use growth to fight climate change. In fact, it's one of our main chances. And he put it nicely, capitalism is responding to people's preferences. It's very efficient, allocating, of course. There are many problems. The prices signal is distorted many times, but I like this quote from the book: with the right policy actions, capitalism can be enlisted as an essential force in the fight against climate change, right? So if we are able to have the right policy settings, that force of capitalism for innovation can be in our advantage, right? So we don't want to give up on that. And then there is a very nice description that gave me quite a bit of hope about countries adopting green technologies and having a competitive advantage, and that motivating other countries to join. Then this green transition also will generate a lot of green jobs. In fact, actually, if we want to generate employment, it's probably the best option that we can do. And something that is very interesting, especially for coming from ASEAN or an area where there are many countries that now going through the economic transition, we have this impression that, oh, if we want to become developed, we have to pollute first. But actually, it's not true. We can now shortcut the circuit and then go from being developing to becoming developed and green. You don't need to destroy all your habitats. You don't need to emit fossil fuels to develop, right? So now there's a green wave transition. If you jump in the wave, you can develop while being green, which I think it was a very nice point. But then also one caveat. Also, it was giving me a lot of hope. I like this caveat that we shouldn't bet the planet on technologies that don't exist yet, right? We see many people talking about carbon capture, something that is going to solve the problem. I don't think that that's going to happen because it's going to take a very long time for it to be competitive and mainstream. So we need to think that we have a huge problem ahead. There's no silver bullet. I think it's a very nice point. No single technology, no single tax, no single policy. We have to do many things and do them all right, do them correctly, to have a proper transition, green transition, while we increase equity, right? So it's not easy, and then we have to keep everybody on board. We shouldn't generate losers. So I think this is my summary of the book. I think it was very useful. I want to try now to, I want to talk also a little bit about some recurrent themes and biodiversity. So one recurrent theme is the issue of comparing beyond GDP versus GDP and beyond, which sounds very similar, but it's not, as Alessio points. So personally, I'm one of those that has a lot of grievances with GDP because it doesn't measure many of the important things, like life satisfaction or destruction of nature, inequality. That's not captured. In fact, destroying nature many times allows to increase the GDP through all the economic transactions involved. So yeah, it's tempting to say, okay, let's do away with GDP altogether. But I think Alessio convinced me that if we want to manage things, we need to measure them. So it's not about throwing the baby with the bathtub water. Let's keep GDP, but try to improve using multidimensional indicators, right? There's several of them. I like one that came from China, actually, the gross ecosystem product. It's a very nice indicator of incorporating ecosystem services into the national account. So I think, yeah, this was also an eye-opener for me. Okay, so carbon and biodiversity, trying now to move from climate change to biodiversity, they are inherently related. They are twin crises, right? They happen together. I mean, one could argue that not always carbon stocks and biodiversity go hand in hand in ecosystems, but okay, if I hope we can argue, we can agree that a healthy ecosystem stores more carbon, right? Everything equal, yeah, that's the case, right? So you can think of analogies, and I think this is a very useful exercise of things that work for climate mitigation. Adaptation could work for biodiversity using economic tools. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about carbon tax. It's one of the main tools for climate change mitigation. Can we have a biodiversity tax? I'm not aware of any biodiversity tax, but I think it will work fantastically. Imagine that if somebody wants to buy beef and eat beef, let them pay for all the externalities in terms of biodiversity ecosystem services that they are causing. Then probably they will think twice about eating beef. There are carbon credits. Biodiversity credits are up and coming as well. They have a lot of problems, same as carbon credits, many more, because we cannot measure biodiversity well. But yeah, perhaps it's something that we should start talking about. Carbon emissions reporting by companies are now becoming common to biodiversity impacts reporting, right? We have the example of the TNFD. So this is a very nascent active area, and I see a lot of things that we can use from the book and from climate change mitigation for biodiversity. Something I liked a lot was this example that Alessio used to indicate how we can use innovation to create growth, economic growth, at the same time that we are benefiting the world, right? He uses a company that creates biodegradable plastic bottles, and they become very successful, and they start hiring more people, creating branches. So we are activating the economy while doing good, right? The same thing could be with biodiversity conservation ideas, right? If there's an appetite, at least for a segment of society, we can come up with innovative solutions. It could be, for example, a plant-based meat, right? We have some companies there that are becoming very successful. And not only they become successful, they grow the economy. They're actually reducing the footprint on biodiversity, right? And the same with wildlife watching. We could have ecotourism companies. We could have any other innovations that could help biodiversity at the same time grow the economy. Some of the things that I see for a good growth in a world for biodiversity would be that we have to continue cultivating the awareness of people that biodiversity conservation is very important, right? Because if people are not aware of that, it's going to be hard. But when people are on board and with the right policies, for example, stopping harmful subsidies or extra exploitative activities, we can help biodiversity. And then when society demands, we can have new technologies, innovation, and then the green economy thrives. Other things that I feel very important for biodiversity, also touch on, is circular economy. We have to decouple extractive activities from economic growth, and then having a valuation of ecosystem services and nature, incorporating them into the national accounts, and factoring in all the externalities of activities that are bad for biodiversity. But then again, I don't want to sound too hopeful that there is an easy solution. I think there is a lot of work to do, and everybody needs to be on board to achieve something. Okay, those are my discussion. Thank you.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you very much to both of you. Alessio, if you want to turn on your mic, and then we can move into the Q&A session. So then really enjoyed both presentations. I think I have read Alessio's books, and you know the content, and he delivers in a very interesting and very approachable way a very complex matter. And Roman has done a terrific job kind of establishing a parallelism between climate change and biodiversity conservation. So maybe what we can do is I will do a couple of quick questions, and then we'll open for the audience. We're a bit behind schedule, so then maybe I will keep my questions short. So then I think Roman did a very good job showing examples of how similar framework can apply in the context of biodiversity conservation. But something that came to mind when I was reading the book is that we can say that climate change, even though it's a very complex problem, perhaps it's a relatively simple problem in which you are dealing with a very simple thing, which is greenhouse emissions and carbon stocks in the atmosphere. So maybe innovation might find a massive breakthrough. Suddenly tomorrow, someone creates a company that can extract carbon from the atmosphere, and we are back to normal. Well, biodiversity, I do see it as a much more complex problem. It's like is that by a million cuts. You have many little problems, a lot of local issues happening. So then there is no way that we can find a way to eradicate biodiversity loss. So actually we need plenty of local actions. So I think that's going to be much more difficult to do from a policy point of view, from an innovation point of view. So then it presents a different challenge. And one more factor that I was thinking is that maybe people feel that climate change affects them more. So it's easier for individuals to perceive that climate change might be a real threat to them, to their well-being. You know, if climate becomes very hostile in 50 years, people understand they might suffer from lack of food or from other environmental hazards. But I think for people, biodiversity is less perceived as a problem that can affect them. Even though we talk about ecosystem services, the link is weaker. So then I was thinking, these two big crises are interlinked, and clearly climate change also has a strong impact on biodiversity conservation. But can they be approached? Are the type of solution that we should look for? Are they similar, or we should be thinking about much more complex approach and dealing with different ways with both of them? So it's a bit long question.
A simple question. I mean, yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking a few things. The first is, it's funny because I rarely encounter people tell me climate change is a simpler problem, and normally it's already seen as the mastodon of global issues. but I understand what you mean. In a way, what I wonder is, surely what you're saying is right, in the sense that there, in a way, what Roman was hinting at also for climate change, in the sense that there's not going to be a single silver bullet, not even a technological one single, but rather you have to break down the problem, and the local, given that there is a local impact on for biodiversity, or rather a local characterization, it will need local solution. What I wonder, my instinctive reaction to it, to what you are saying is it true that people will realize less the impact of biodiversity loss than climate change? And the reason why I'm asking that is that one of the issues with climate change itself for a long time has been that the impacts are long-term, so there is a temporal dimension, and they're spread. And so you are adding to a global problem, to the atmosphere, but the atmosphere reacts, meaning that emissions in the US might end up generating a typhoon in Southeast Asia. Whereas I suspect, and what you're hinting at seems to suggest so, biodiversity is more local, or has a more local component, like other environmental problems, like water pollution, river pollution, for example, or quality of the air. So if I use a crappy car, the quality of the air will become worse in my city. And so I'm contributing to a more local problem. And that, to a certain extent, lends some hope in the fact that local environmental problems have been easier to solve. And so you see that when there has been awareness, so Roman's point is fundamental, but when there has been awareness, whether the problem was acid rains, whether the problem was plastic in the rivers, whether the problem was a variety of local pollution situations, they have been solved, typically in countries that can afford them. So again, the importance of growth and having the resources to address these problems. But that, to a certain extent, lends some hope. And if you allow me one point that connects what you're saying with what Roman was saying, which I think is going to be the crucial aspect for biodiversity loss in generating awareness and in starting to develop policy solutions, is that we need to improve measurement, because measurement is where everything starts. And I know that there are a variety of indicators that try to capture biodiversity loss, but if we don't manage to hone and to zoom into one indicator that sort of is agreed and understandable and can give us a clear picture, it is very hard to generate awareness, and it is very hard to start developing biodiversity credits, biodiversity taxes, and these type of policies that also Roman was provocatively and rightly so, I believe, introducing.
Yeah, Roman.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think biodiversity problem is more complicated because we're not talking about one currency like CO2 equivalent. We're talking about millions of species and very different ecosystems, and what works in a place doesn't work in another place. So I think it's a very difficult problem, and also in terms of using innovation to solve it, it would be different values in different places. So yeah, I think I'm with you. I think the challenge is greater for biodiversity, and I don't have an answer on how to make it work. Yeah.
So I think we'll pass to questions from the audience. So maybe, Jan-Hon, can you read us the questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have received a lot of questions from our online audience. The first two questions are: is it necessary to measure everything to manage. For example, financialization of nature, REDD, species values. Can this measurement helps to reduce biodiversity loss or promote social well-being? And the second question is a bit relevant. Do you think that there will be another scaling parameter of growth rather than technology in the future to reconcile nature and the economy? Yeah, thank you.
So on measure, in a way, I was hinting at it already in what I was saying before. But I think that indeed measurement is where things start, because it is where we can get more precise on things. And so you can know on aggregate that, I don't know, bees are important because they're pollinators and therefore they contribute to our broad well-being on a variety of ways, and they contribute to production in agriculture and so on. So you can know that, but you need to be able to measure it, because measurement is where you will start realizing trade-offs. And so that is a bit what we try to do in economics. We do it in a crude way. It leads to us being accused of, as economists, being accused of knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. But the reason why we try to attach or estimate values of things is that it makes them comparable, so that as a policymaker, you can then make choices. And if it means prioritizing in certain settings and realizing that there is more value in keeping that share of land and to its natural habitat, because it has repercussions that are larger than any benefit we could draw from an alternative use, you have to be able to measure that and to compare it. And that is a bit why we started measuring things, measuring the economy the way we do it, and to be more precise in policy making, if you want to call it this way. But again, measurement is not, and I want to underline this because I think it's an important point, measurement is not a recent phenomenon. So trying to measure things is as old as history. Again, it would come in the shape of trying to measure the amount of people your land had, the amount of agricultural produce that your land generated. You were trying to do this, and this has a history of millennia, because it gives you a sense of the resources you can use and then how to allocate these resources to alternative uses or priorities. The second point, you were asking me, are we really going to engineer our way out of the problem? And can we engineer our way out of biodiversity issues? I think to an extent, maybe more than what I have in mind is not engineering per se addressing the problem directly, but rather it hints to the flexibility of the economy that I was hinting at before. Which is to say, if Ahimsa tells me that a certain share of land needs to be restored and needs to be given back to nature, will this mean the end of growth? Or will this mean the end of the economy? I suspect not. In the sense that we will find new ways of doing the things we want to do, even with less land, even with less sea, again, hinting at this idea that the economy is a flexible concept and that it responds to incentives and relative prices to a certain extent. And so, yes, I believe that it can be done. And maybe the engineering part is not so much related to the biodiversity directly in addressing that problem. So I'm not thinking that we will develop drones to substitute bee loss in pollinating. This is not what I have in mind, but rather it is the fact that maybe we will let the bees be, or we will stop using fertilizer or pesticides if that is what is affecting biodiversity, for example, and I'm sure there are many other reasons, including climate change, and we will find different ways of doing agriculture that will safeguard yields and will let bees thrive where they are.
Yeah, that's kind of a utopic vision of the future, right? So we use engineering and innovation and technology to produce what we want, and we leave nature aside to do what nature is, right? That will be the best case scenario for the next, the end of the century. Yeah. So, Roman, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think on measurements, yeah, I think measurement is useful, especially thinking of biodiversity offsets and trying to prioritize scarce conservation budgets. We need to know what are the things that we need to protect and conserve. So I think the measurement helps yeah, in that sense. Regarding the engineering problem, and we're talking about wicked problems, yeah, I agree it's a wicked problem. It's very complex. And I think that we shouldn't be too optimistic on technology will save us. I think we need to couple it with the right policies. And sometimes the policies will have to limit certain types of consumption that are detrimental for the sustainability of the planet. So I think yeah, it's a balance between. I think Alessio put it nicely in the book. It's a balance between command and control and laissez-faire policies, right? We want to let the economy thrive, but we also want to direct it to places where it's helping. But yeah, I think it's not an engineering problem. It's much more complicated. It will take some hard policies to steer in the right way the economy.
Yeah. Do we have more questions?
Yeah, sure.
So
We
maybe,
have,
please go ahead.
yeah, okay, thank you. We have received another two questions about inequality between countries. The first one is, thanks a lot, Alessio. I have a question from GDP and the energy graph of US that you showed. US economic growth is mostly due to services provided, which may have resulted in flat energy line. But this cannot be done by all the countries for development. They may need to depend on energy for growth. Since energy is crucial for economic production. So how do you think these countries can attain a balance between economic growth and nature? And the second question is, thank you, Professor Terzi, for the presentation. It cleared some of my misunderstandings. You mentioned the degrowth in rich countries. How about the degrowth in underdeveloped countries with better environmental resources? And the developed compensate the economic growth of these underdeveloped countries, because the developed countries are more likely to achieve innovation and grow economic in an eco-friendly way. What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you. It's very good. It's very good questions. So the first point is right to one extent, in the sense that what you're saying, and underline, is true, which is the US economy, like many developed economies, is service-led, and so that helps when you are when you want to end up using less energy. But I was sort of using that chart to make the wider point, which is to say that there is not a one-to-one relationship between the economy and energy use. And you could use it even within countries. And I can give you an example from Europe, for example. So last year, there was obviously an energy crisis. Energy prices went through the roof. And as a result, there was a huge, let's say, methane use went down by roughly 20%. Production stayed more or less constant. So even focusing only on manufacturing, not services, we focus on manufacturing, production stayed more or less the same. What this means is that there is a lot of slack in the way you use energy, and that it reacts to prices, and that it reacts to incentives. And so that there are multiple ways of getting things done, some that are more energy intensive and some that are less energy intensive, but you don't give priority to it until you have to. And when you have to, then you devise new ways of doing things. So again, an innovation perspective, but not innovation again as an engineering solution, but maybe as a process solution. So you reinvent the processes of production to reduce energy. But the point is wider, and I think it links to a certain extent to the second one, which is to say, in the countries that need to grow, how are they going to do that? And okay, the leaders, technological leaders, can develop new ways of producing energy or new ways of doing things in a green way. But what can other countries do? Less developed countries do, and to an extent, I hear a lot of this argument, which is framed in a bit of a different way, and it is to say, look, we are aware of climate change, we are aware of environmental problems, but we have another priority, and our priority is to generate economic growth, to generate jobs, to lift people out of poverty, and therefore we have to prioritize that, and we will think about nature later on. Right now, that is a concern, that is a luxury, and so rich countries can focus on that luxury. We will focus on it later. And I sort of push back against this argument on multiple dimensions. And the first, because I believe that it builds on some premises that might be true now, but are likely to remain true for a limited period of time. The first is to believe that you will have growth by focusing on current technologies, on current ways of production, on current industrialization, on using fossil fuels, and so on. And I believe, and this again links to Roman's point on the importance of awareness and consumer awareness, I believe that increasingly consumers are concerned, aware, and looking for products that are less heavy on nature or on climate or on CO2 emissions. And as there is this shift, let's say, exporting your way out of poverty and producing things for global markets and selling them on global markets, if they are polluting items, will become harder and harder. And so the window of opportunity for development, let's say, by specializing on polluting technologies or polluting products, is shrinking fast. It's not closed yet, absolutely, but I think that it is shrinking fast. The second point that I think is worth mentioning is that this reading of the world is based or built on the premise that the cheap technology is the polluting technology. And so I will use the polluting technology because that is the cheapest, and then the more expensive one is the green one, and that is for the luxury and for the rich countries. And here the point is crucial, which is to say, if these technologies are cheap, is a product of the fact that we've been investing in them for now over 2 centuries. And it is not an inbuilt characteristic of the technology per se. And that rather, as we start investing and scaling up, including in rich countries, so as richer countries, ranging from the United States to Japan, to South Korea, to the UK, to China, to India, and so on, as they scale up production of solar panels, of installation of wind, and so on, the prices of these technologies are dropping. This is an incredibly robust relationship that as the scale of something goes up, the production costs go down. You will see very soon that the green technology will correspond to the cheap technology. In many of these things, Ahimsa called me a bit utopian before, because it sounds like I'm coming here and saying these things that will happen maybe in 1 century. For many of these technologies, this is either already the case, or it's about to happen within the next 2 or 3 years based on current technological projections. And so the risk is that in seeking development, you decide to specialize using current polluting technologies in the belief that these are the cheap ones, and very soon you will realize within a few years' time that you invested on the wrong one, that will not give you development because you will not manage to export products produced in that way, and it will also be the more expensive technology because of the investment that is going into the green transition. And so that is why I believe that it is smart to try and seek green, what is called green development. Roman already hinted at it before in saying you can leapfrog many of the technologies of the past and leash yourself to sectors that are growing immensely right now, whether it is battery production, whether it is electric vehicles, whether it is the extraction of some of these green minerals, whether it is the production of solar panels, and so on and so forth. So there is a variety of things that are growing at exponential trend. If you manage to catch that train, you will have development, you will do it in a more sustainable way, and it will be more sustainable also in terms of the duration of it for the longer term.
So, Roman, you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, I think yeah, everything revolves a little bit about climate injustice. I agree that it's possible to decouple energy consumption and GDP, but also there's the issue of when we look at the US graphs, there's all this decoupling. They are, yeah, the polluting activities have moved to other countries now, so that makes them also look quite good. But I think it's possible. And also the issue is that developing countries also will need help to transition, to do the energy transition fast. And I think there are estimates in the order of $trillions just for Asia. But then we see that countries, they argue a lot, they cannot agree on giving a few billions to developing countries. So yeah, it's an issue there of there should be more support to help developing countries have a rapid energy transition. So I think that's a good point. Yeah. It's all injustice. Yeah.
Thank you both. So I think we will close. Maybe I have one final question. So first, Alessio, sorry, I was not calling you utopian in a negative way. I was saying that the scenario I was drawing was utopian. You know, the best case scenario compared with the dystopian of everything will be wrong. So this is mainly addressed to Alessio because you are working in the European Commission, you have been involved in the European Green Deal. So then but also to Roman working on biodiversity. You know that last year we had many nations signed the Global Biodiversity Framework, the post-2020 framework that sets up, you know, the policy for conservation for the next decade and for the next 3 decades. So then I want to ask, how optimistic and how positive are you on the role of policy in playing a role addressing this crisis, both climate change and biodiversity loss? Do you think that are kind of a main driver of the potential solutions? Do you think that play some positive but small role? Do you think that, you know, it's not really, they're not so important and things will happen because, you know, people self-organize? What is your take on this?
So at least, again, my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding of that agreement, to a certain extent, the approach that I'm mentioning in my discussion here today, is that for many, not all, biodiversity is a complex matter, but for many of these issues, the objective is to get out of the way. And that is to say, we are devoting more of our land, of our seas, to protected areas, and that in doing that, we're allowing for at least to preserve some biodiversity there and increase overall resilience of species. Now, from a let's say theoretical perspective, I told you I trust that this is possible, and that the fact that we are leaving some land or some sea to itself is not going to be the end of the economy or the end of growth or the beginning of misery. So that from a theoretical point of view. How to achieve that? Clearly, there is a strong policy component in the fact that you're trying to get people out of it. And so it is not so much about generating value as it is what I'm professing on climate change, of trying to be a leader in the green technology per se, and that is generating returns. Here it's a matter of leaving out some areas, and so not generating returns. Again, this is possible. This is done. National parks exist, and they have existed for a while, and they're not a recent invention. The US has not collapsed as an economy when Teddy Roosevelt introduced national parks. So we are scaling up that approach, and there is obviously a strong policy component. Where the private sector component comes in, to my mind, is that we will have to reinvent, of course, some parts of production or some types of the economy. So if communities were fishing in parts of these areas, now we are instead fencing them out, those communities will have to have new ways of generating income. And in that, the private sector will play an important role. So it is a bit the interplay of these forces, but surely policy plays an important role.
No, I think policy is key at the international level. We see that it's a bit difficult to reach agreements, and even the Paris Agreement is not really. It's more based on each country does what they can. The national determined contributions are determined by each country, but it's interesting how countries have entered a race to try to do more. So I think that was quite positive. And yeah, definitely we need strong policies to really steer the economy in the right direction.
Thank you very much, both of you. I think we can leave it here for today. It's about 1 hour and a half now. So then, of course, saying thank you to both speakers, to Alessio and to Roman, for the very interesting presentations plus discussion.